Greetings! Anton here with an H3VR devlog. It's going to be a bit of a talky one this week, in part because I have been spending almost all of my energy on prepping for something very important that is happening Monday. So we're actually going to start off today with an announcement of importance. Upload VR is doing an E3 VR showcase on Monday at 9 a.m. PST, and we have a little trailer video in it that will be relevant to many of you. I'm super excited for it. It is something that I have been working on in H3 in parallel, in secret, for a while now, and it is this seemed like the moment to show it off. So make sure to tune in. Link below in the description if you're wondering where to go to watch that on Monday at 9 a.m. PST. So now that that's over, what are we going to cover in today's devlog? So there's a couple things. I'm going to go over basically some leftover stuff from the last update and the ongoing patches and hotfixes that I've been doing for it. Stuff that's about sort of the state of various platform supports, locomotion changes, new controller models, and things like that. And then after I get through that nitty-gritty, I want to cover a topic that comes up a lot and is something that I haven't really talked at length in the devlog format on maybe in a couple years. And so I realized it was one of those types of things that the early community for the game from like 2.5 years ago understood where I stood on things and why things were the way they were. But a lot of the newer users and newer watchers and things like that might not have. So we're going to be covering in detail basically why there's no networked multiplayer in H3 and why, as a designer, it's not really a compelling space and why I'm not interested in really exploring it. So, but I figured I would actually put that, I typed the same explanation over and over, oftentimes a little abbreviated and short, so I figured I would go over it in depth as a way not just to cover that, but to talk about some of the things that are different about video games that are single player versus multiplayer from a technical and a design standpoint, and how they're relevant to H3 and also relevant to the way that I like to make things. So we're going to cover that after we get through a few details here. So update 72 fixes and patches and things like that. This has been a rough past week. Any of you who've been hanging out on the Discord and such know that this past weekend was really rough for me because I launched update 72 and got a barrage of bugs and user issues of every kind imaginable that took me through the weekend. Huge thanks to Keith over at Valve, who held me together and helped me bug fix some of the worst of it. I think I would have just stepped out into traffic without him. But the worst has been dealt with. Basically, for those of you who don't know, the entire input sort of substrate of the game changed. It was updated to a far newer version. I'm really bad about staying up to date with things like that. So it wasn't just new input, but I updated like the version of the Steam VR plugin I was using and rewrote everything about the way input flows into the hands and even how hands are detected and things like that. So tons of stuff broke and I had to, you know, tune and adjust things. There was a couple different sort of behavioral regressions that happened. So like Vive users with worn out or older Vive controllers noticed that they had really unreliable triggers, and that's because default trigger behavior changed in the binding, so I had to revert that. Should be working now. But yeah, a whole bunch of little stuff. It's mostly stabilized. In terms of what still needs to be done, there are a couple things. One, there's still a couple locomotion modes that I broke. Robo Recall style teleport is broken at the moment. Sprint is missing on Twin Stick, and I think 2-axis locomotion on WMR doesn't work. Like it's clicking on the touchpad both does weapon function and locomotion. So those are all combination of regressions and oversights. I'm going to deal with those this month. let's see, is that all those? I'm also going to probably add one more speed setting for 2-axis, especially for those of you who don't want to like wear out your touchpads having to click to sprint all of the time. So that's in there. Rift S controller models will go in as soon as I get a pair of actual meshes and the detection works on a non-beta branch of SteamVR. Oh, and then in terms of the SteamVR input binding system, man, I have made a discovery as a developer, which is finding out in doing this transition just how screwball some of the custom bindings that folks were using were set up. I had no idea that folks were rewiring certain things so significantly. Like, as in, like, actually moving controls from each hand like this so that they were clustered way more asymmetrically than I would have ever thought. And because of the way the default binding is set up now with non-handed actions, some of that rebinding is not possible. I'm going to look into this month, even though it's going to require a whole bunch of recoding and redefining actions again, into making some of that possible again by actually manually defining left trigger, left grip, left primary 2-axis, etc. So if you want to do unusual asymmetric bindings, or if you have limited use of one of your hands and need to move things over to another controller, you will be able to do that again. I just want to make sure to stage it carefully and make sure that I don't break everything for everyone again before I dive 2 feet into that. So that is upcoming. As for Take and Hold, thankfully, there don't seem to be really any issues with it. There was one issue with scoring that I think I fixed. It was sort of the Steam scoreboard system wasn't initializing, but that should all be working fine. And later this month, I'll be throwing in a few more characters for that, for those of you who want even more variety and some new, fresh scoreboards to dominate. So, now that we've gotten the little things out of the way there, let's talk about our sort of like topic du jour, which is why is there no multiplayer in H3? Why is there never going to be networked multiplayer? And I want to preface this by the fact that this explanation is not, because this happens to me all the time, this is not an invitation for people to come in and backseat dev to me and tell me, well, I would just do X and Y and Z and you should do A, B, and C and things like that. I'm not interested. I've been working on this for 3.5 years. This is a made decision, and you don't know the architecture of the game I do. So, preface over, let's talk about the sort of categories of why no networked multiplayer. And I want to clarify, the reason I say why no networked multiplayer is because there's still a possibility in the future that I might do a second seat mode of some kind, where someone could sit at the computer with a mouse and a keyboard, or a gamepad of some kind, and do something sort of asymmetrically with the player in VR. I don't have anything planned at the moment for that, but it's an open possibility. Networking is not, and there are a whole bunch of reasons for it. So I want to go over today the sort of 3 categories of those things. There are technical reasons, there are design reasons, and then there's cost reasons. So let's start with the technical stuff. So H3's architecture differs from other games very, very significantly, and it varies for a couple reasons. The first one being the fact that it is like a giant pile of experiments and ideas that has just been, more things have been thrown on top of with desperate refactoring over the past 3.5 years. It is not architected the way that you would usually go about architecting a game, because in a big way it started with the objects that I was interested in simulating and playing around with, and sort of spiraled out from there, instead of actually having like an intentional, well-planned, unified sort of baseline. And so there are tons of things that are really hard-coded into this spider web of its architecture, like the fact that there is only ever one player, in part because of legacy decisions, and in part for really, really fast performant access to things. It's the sort of like singleton of doom programming pattern. Some of you know what I mean when I say that, and you're going like this right now. So there's that. On top of that, I always say H3 in particular ways is always a hair's breadth from imploding from a performance standpoint. And the reason for that is that I'm doing a set of things physics-wise that generally you should not do, or at least that was very much the case when I started the project. Everyone's computers have gotten 3.5 years faster on average. But the physics complexity of all of the firearms, the way the way that so many of them are represented as complex hierarchies, and the fact that you can make an arbitrarily deep hierarchy of attachments on firearms means that something that is usually very inexpensive in a game, you know, just a first-person view and you're holding a gun in your hand, is the exact opposite in H3. In fact, there are many things that are simple in H3, like environment models, overall environment physics complexity, things like that, that aren't just simple because they're faster to do or cheaper to do, but because I actually have to keep so much of my performance sort of headroom for the wild stuff that the player is going to do with the firearms, the way they're going to modify them, the fact that even casings coming out of a weapon are a full-featured, physics-active object, means that just the entire performance profile of the game is super atypical, and you can't count on certain things being tenable that would be tenable in a normal game. On top of that, the next thing is that from just the way that games tend to get networked, the way that tends to work is that when you design a networked game, you're attempting to minimize the amount of data that you are sending between all of your users, for both latency and just overall bandwidth usage standpoint, especially because of the way things have to be, like if one person does something, it has to be updated to all of those users. Most multiplayer games probably send far less data than you might imagine, and essentially use that as keys to synchronize more complex things. H3 has none of the things that you typically need to be able to do that, especially in a traditional shooter. So an example of that is when you're in H3 and you have a local copy of a rifle. There's a moving bolt and a charging handle in your magazines and the state that the muzzle flashes in, any sort of moving part of it. And as you're firing it, there's all sorts of data moving back and forth across inside that firearm. That in and of itself is way too much data to network, especially when you talk about like 4 or 8 or 16 people. And the way that most shooter games do this is that they sort of represent the entire state of the firearm as just a very small amount of numbers, like keyframes in the animation state or the state machine of that firearm, and they pass that around so that it looks roughly synchronized. It's possible for those games to represent that, to sort of unpack that data into representing the firearm on other players in the networked environment, because one, all those firearms and player models run on animations, which H3s don't. They're all simulations. So I can't just be like, show me the state of an AKM 75% of the way through firing right now. I have no ability to forward simulate the firearm up to that place to match it to what a local player would be doing. And I don't have things like LODs for anything, because there's this assumption that you're always close up to what you're using. So yeah, so what it basically means is that from multiple vectors, the game is just too expensive to network unless tremendous amounts of it were rebuilt from scratch, both from a code perspective and from an asset perspective. Roughly an entire whole game's worth of effort, which even if I was interested in doing, would be a huge expense. So that's largely the technical issues that are encompassed. The design reasons, and this is a slightly broader topic because this isn't just about H3 per se, but it's about the relationship of it to other shooter games and what folks expect out of a multiplayer shooter in general, which is that because H3 is so simulation driven, the one thing that can't be done to it is that it can't be balanced like a traditional shooter. Or to balance it like a traditional shooter would be to undermine so much of what makes it interesting. In that the pretty much every shooter you've ever played. I don't know about Arma. I haven't seen the damage tables in Arma, so I won't speak to the sort of super detailed milsim games. But by and large, any multiplayer shooter game diverges so far from the actual relative effectiveness, muzzle energies, and performance of real world weaponry because it's all multiplayer shooter games, even the really detailed ones, are sports, and sports are usually predicated on the fact that even if they're not perfectly symmetric, there's a sort of order and regularity and predictability to things, and that each side has an appropriate chance to do well. Balancing, like attempting to, like if you were to throw in H3's firearms and damage tables into most first person games, 95 to 98% of the entire arsenal would never be utilized because people optimize in multiplayer game situations towards sort of like power to control ability to deploy, deliverability very, very rapidly. Such that most multiplayer shooter games are tuned to incredibly narrow margins. So not only is that something that sort of runs counter to the way that H3 is structured, I think I would rather like drag my face across a piece of 20 grit sandpaper than do that type of balancing work. It's the opposite of what I find enjoyable. The other problem in regards to sort of balance, and I think this is still something that I see affecting other VR shooters to a certain degree. Every developer has a different way to deal with it. And I think even pancake shooters have this issue a little bit, which is the how do you balance things when you have radically different performance profiles? The reality is that a huge percentage of VR users are still running, like they have to turn the quality settings of their game down, the rendering complexity down to hold frame rate, and changing things related to light and object silhouette, object density, and things like that means that you have people who are seeing different things. And so, as I said, it's an issue in pancake games. It's way more of an issue in VR because rendering is just that much more challenging. And then lastly, in terms of how to put it, there is a component of shall we say sort of games culture that comes along with competitive multiplayer games that has always just sort of rubbed me the wrong way. It attracts a particular sort of aggressiveness. It attracts yeah, it's H3 has always been in general a far more chill sort of community and culture in general, and I've been part of and been party to the sort of communities and cultures of competitive of multiplayer shooters before, and it's one of those like, nope, sorry, not interested. Mute. So. And then the third category is, even beyond all of that, is cost that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. I think if anything, in the past, say, 5 to 6 years, the operating costs for doing a multiplayer game well have gone up. They haven't gone down, despite the fact that we have sort of pervasive cloud services. Some of this has to do with sort of secondary licensing and necessities of like a really good anti-cheat system. Part of it is, with something like H3 would be a tremendous amount of data, so that cost would be higher. But even beyond that, like to run a multiplayer game well, and I don't just mean that from a technical standpoint, but from a like community moderation standpoint, like those are all constant costs, you know, ones that sort of like keep having to be paid out relative to a game that just has a single cost up front. And I'm not interested in selling or running a game that costs anyone dollars per month or is supported by a microtransaction schema or something like that. I'm not passing any sort of inherent judgment on other people's business models in that. It's just not what I want my life to be wrapped around. I don't need any of those difficulties and challenges. As a designer, they're all distractions from what I find to be compelling and joyful. And so I will hold off having any of them in my life as long as possible. So yeah, so I hope that gives you an idea of why and the depth, that it isn't just a flippant thing. I know I've been called things like lazy over the past years for not doing it. A lot of people have a misconception that that's something that you can weld onto an existing game, like just adding a level, when the correct metaphor is as though you are building an entirely new game. And given that it's that volume work and the fact that it's not a game that I want to make, it makes about as much sense as yelling at me to make a simulation game about tugboats. So I hope that was not over long, and I hope it was educational to some of you in terms of hearing about sort of the thought processes as a designer when you're thinking about what type of game to make, the differences between them, and such, and why it is such a hard no from us. So, anywho, to wrap up this video, as I said, tune in on Monday at 9 a.m. To the Upload VR H3VR. There's no update today. I'm still gathering data and tuning some patch stuff. There will probably be a patch or an alpha either next Friday or the following one, because I want to continue to, as I said, tune up locomotion modes. But for the most part, this, and you'll understand why on Monday, this month is going to be just about small amounts of polish and making sure that the massive changes that were put into play last week work, and that they are bug free, so that I can actually move forward to other things and I'm not having to get distracted and run back panicked with a wrench to fix things I thought were done. Anywho, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all Monday. Peace.